How can we fight misinformation in politics? That's the topic of today's live stream. I'm Adriel Briscoe here with Wikilection, and we'll jump right in. Oops, that's the wrong page. Jump to politics. So if this happens to be the first live stream that you're watching, today's topic is politics. That's sort of the central focus of Wikilection, as you might be able to guess by the name. There are two other elements for news and science that aren't covered here that are pretty important parts of how to fight misinformation in politics. But today we're going to talk about the information specific to politics, like the politicians and parties and elections and so on. So as this opening slide says, the following slides are going to show what kind of information is available for elections, the political parties, and the politicians themselves. First things, we'll talk about what information will be available around politics, so sort of the history for politicians and the political parties. So for each politician, we want information around where their funding comes from. That's both for sort of the funding that they get during an election to help with their campaign and anything else that they might get, in the form of lobbying funds or any other sort of funding benefit, either for their campaign or personally. And as well, any industry ties. So maybe they didn't get the money directly for a campaign, but if they have heavy ties to an industry that helped them finance it, that might still be relevant. When it comes to political campaigns in an election, we want to track what promises are made. And then for the person that wins, we want to track what the outcome of those promises are. So what percentage of the promises were made, sort of were the bigger promises delivered, that sort of thing. When it comes to spending public funds, what are their priorities? What do they tend, to take money away from? What do they tend to put money towards? What do they never touch? That sort of thing. For the legislation history, now, one of the important things that's sort of a side piece here is the legislation needs to be reviewed by the Wikilection community so we can understand what sort of categories it fits into. So if somebody votes for or against it, what does that show that they might either just value in general or that they might value one thing over another, right? So if a certain piece of legislation maybe shows to value the environment over business, then maybe if you vote for it, then that doesn't mean that you hate business. It just means that in this case, the way that legislation is structured, you value the environment more than the business outcome. And if you vote against it, it will be the opposite, where you might not hate the environment, you value that benefit to the business more than whatever the environment would get sort of hit by not doing it. Now, based on those reviews of the legislation, we can look at which of those pieces of legislation each politician sort of was actively involved in, if they drafted it, sponsored it, that sort of thing. And then when it comes time to vote on it, how did they vote? We can also look at what positions they've appointed, if they're in a role that's allowed to appoint positions, right? So like the leader of a country, where there's a president or prime minister, that sort of thing, they're typically allowed to appoint various people to roles, and that's an important part of that job. So we want to track not only that person's sort of how they did in the role, but also all the people they appointed and how those people did in their roles, since they're partially responsible because they appointed them. We want to track the important events to do with that person. So that can be achievements, that can be maybe things that the public didn't like, that can be scandals, crimes, that can be sort of anything important that the community at large thinks should be on file for this person, and then the community can decide sort of what to upvote and downvote and what's the most important. And then we also want to have information on their experience. So how experienced are they? What sort of roles have they had in the past? What sort of skills does it seem like they might have? And then as well, when it comes to their experience and their expertise, we're going to be tracking what claims they've made. And we talk about expert history in the science portion of the Wikilection live streams. But in this case, we want to know what claims that person has made. We can compare it to their expertise, and we can also track over time how accurate they are sort of per topic. So maybe a politician is great with the economy, not so great with science. When they make claims on the economy, they tend to be accurate, and maybe when they make claims based around science, it's not that trustworthy, that sort of thing. Now, when we look at the political parties, There's going to be a lot of the same information that we're tracking for politicians. And in some cases, it might actually just be used to sort of group the politicians, to say all the politicians in this party, here is the average kind of information available, or sorry, like here's the average things those people do, how they vote, that sort of thing. As well, the political parties are going to have their own funding sources, just like a politician. And again, where did that come from? What sort of industry ties does that give? We can look at the party platform, where you can see, generally speaking, across elections, the party platform tends to be fairly consistent. So that means even if a politician who's a part of a party is making these grand promises, if they disagree with the party platform, you can probably, bet that it's the party platform is going to be the thing that prevails. You can look at the party leadership, right? So if the party leadership changes over time, you can sort of see how that may be a turning point for it. That may just be more of the same, but that's important information to know who leads a party and sort of who's at the top. And then just like we're tracking important events for politicians, we'd want the important events for the political parties, which again, there's going to be a lot of overlap. If an event might be that a certain party banded together to either get legislation passed or, not passed, then that's important information on a per politician basis. So you know how each person voted, but also overall what that party tends to be for or against. Here we have a screenshot of what, sorry, not a screenshot, a mock-up of what one view of a politician's history might be. So in this case, we're looking at a timeline. This top part here, right, I'm in presentation mode, so I can't move that arrow. The arrow is pointing to an event called excessive expenses, and you can see the little blue arrows coming out the top of it. That's pointing to where those events happened in that person's timeline. You can see in the timeline it's pointing to, so the excessive expenses happened 3 times while this person was a council member. You can see before they were a council member, they were on the school board, and before that they were a teacher. While they were on the school board, it's actually blocking the good one, which was they exceeded the fundraising record. So that's actually a good thing on file for this person. And then they became a council member and they started to have excessive expenses. Underneath, you can see the content that supports that claim. So if we're going to have something on, in this case, the politician's name is Stephen Connor. If we're going to have something on Stephen Connor's profile, we want to make sure that we can back it up. So people can't just go and say anything about anyone. You do want to make sure that there is a decent amount of evidence to back it up. And if you look at the bottom part of that box for excessive expenses, you can see there's a part that says confirmed, and that's saying because there's some information backing it up. The community has decided that this is related to the finances category, and they've said that it's a bad thing in that category, right? So if you look in the fundraising record, there was a good for finances, and then in excessive expenses, they overspent, so now it's a bad thing. You can see sort of the voting for popularity, that sort of thing. And one interesting thing here is it's actually showing 3 different times that same thing happened. So we do want to make sure that if there's one particular thing or a few things that a certain person does time and time again, we don't want to flood their page with just those things. You sort of want to group them all together and say, hey, this person has a history of spending excessively. Here's all the times that happened, but then here's the other things to keep in mind about that person too. The next example is the one to the right of that, called abuse of power. In this example, that was meant to sort of come out of the excessive expenses. In the right up here, it says that the person that sort of, I guess, got this person in trouble for excessive expenses ended up being fired when this person became mayor. And so now the topic is around, was that an abuse of power for them to become mayor and then fire somebody in their past who they had some personal issues with. You can see the supporting evidence underneath. And again, there's 3 articles. Now, with the way that this is structured, this one isn't confirmed because it was it went to court, it was thrown out, and now we're not sure, but the community still says we're still pretty sure. This is an area where it's not 100% clear how we'll end up dealing with it, because we don't want things just to go away if it happened to be that something happened in the court case where it didn't happen, but the public overall and experts involved say, no, we probably shouldn't just discount that. There's a good chance it's real, but we also don't want to give people false things on their record. So there will end up needing to be a balance of, you can sort of submit anything about a person, but there does have to be some quality control to make sure that we're reasonably sure that these things did happen. The next example is what we're calling, I guess, video snippets. So what we're seeing here is a fairly typical video player. In this case, it's a campaign rally for that same person that the previous mockups were about, Stephen Connor. So at this campaign rally, right, you'll normally hear a person sort of make multiple claims or multiple just things that they're saying to help themselves get elected. In this screenshot, you can see it's sort of halfway through the video. The red arrow is pointing to where to where it's at in the video. Right underneath that, you see that sort of orange box with the number 3. Those are meant to be snippets. So each of those numbers relates to that, like the width of each box shows how long that snippet is in that video. So right as soon as that sort of the dot showing where the video is starts at number 3, this player shows, hey, right now he's talking about a claim that traffic got better during his time in office. And then you can see, underneath it says the claim is that traffic is better. In the top right of that box, it says that that's mostly false. And then you've got a write-up from sort of the community saying, hey, while some minor improvements were made, we didn't make improvements to the high density areas. That actually got worse, which means it actually got worse overall. And that's something that the community decides. So you can start to get an idea for when the person makes a claim saying how something actually happened, how does that relate to what the community feels that that's true? Now, not everything in a political speech can be proven true or false. If somebody is making a promise, you can't prove that true or false yet, right? So you can see in the bottom right, it lists the 5 snippets, right? There's 2. There's 2 promises. That's number 2 and 5, and then there's 3 claims, numbers 1, 3, and 4. If we look at a promise, right? So number 2, he's saying in again this campaign rally that he's going to promise that there's going to be a new arena built. Well, if the arena isn't built yet, again, we can't prove that true or false. All we can do is we can record that it was said, so that later on, if we're tracking Stephen Connor's campaign promises and the arena doesn't get built and there's any pushback around, I never said that I was going to, every time that person said it during the election, we have a recording of it. So we can say, well, here's some videos of 12 times you did say it, you said it. So it's not only recording that it happened so that you can sort of indicate, hey, this is there, but now later on, we can use that to sort of prove, okay, here you said it, that promise did happen. Now, did you actually complete that promise? When it comes to elections, that's sort of what ties a lot of this together, right? If we're tracking information about the politicians and about their promises, one of the main times that information becomes important is during an election, when you sort of have the most chance to affect change within politics. So one of the first things that is an important part of Wikilection are the election issues. So at the sort of the base level, we're tracking the issues that might matter to members, to the voting public. The easiest example of that are going to be what we call ballot measures, right? So if you've ever seen something like Proposition 123 on an election that people are voting on, that's a ballot measure. And that's a really obvious election issue where it's not a person you're voting on an issue, but you kind of have 2 choices, for or against. And so we can track the information available for the for and against, and all the information on how that boils down and what the experts that are relevant in that sort of area, what they're saying, so that you can get sort of a nice broad overview of the whole thing, not through one particular viewpoint, but that's been put through the full community. Next are the items that the media is discussing, right? So that's like if there's a big election and you watch the news, there's going to be certain items that the news sort of puts forward as what either what they feel are the most important, or what their audience has said is the most important. Now, that's not going to be exhaustive. There's going to be a ton of issues that the media won't cover, either because they don't have time, or maybe it doesn't fit their narrative. So the community can also submit issues, and they can say, hey, even though this issue it's not, we aren't voting on it directly, it's not a ballot measure, and the media is not talking about it, but a bunch of the people who are voting in this election have said that this is important. So we'll want to track what the politicians involved are saying about that issue. Now, for each issue, just like on the previous thing where we're sort of tracking like the legislation and the topics involved so that we can see how somebody prioritizes, we have the same sort of topics for election issues, because not everyone is going to care about the same thing. You might have some election issues are business, some issues are environmental, some might be around free speech, whatever they are. Not everyone cares about the same thing. So you can tell the system what you care about, and it's going to use that information to bubble up what it thinks you're going to care about. Now, what it's not going to do, if you say that you care about the environment, you aren't saying if you're for or against it. You're just saying, I'm interested in that topic, which means it might be showing you things that you disagree with, but it's in the topic that you said you're interested in. So this is not meant to be an echo chamber. And then within each topic, you can rank the issue as to how important that issue is to that topic, right? So you might have a topic that has a little bit to do with the environment, so it might not show up on the list of environmental issues if there's a bunch of other ones, but maybe it's really important to business. So if you say that you're interested in business and not environment, it might show up. If you say that you're interested in the environment and not business, it might not be scored high enough to show up. The next thing in the elections becomes the roles that are actually involved. So those will be the individual roles that people will be voting on, right? Things like if it's a local election, you might be voting on who the mayor is going to be. You might be voting on who's going to be on the city council. Those are the roles. Now, for each role, we want an idea of what the responsibilities are. What, if somebody gets in this role, what are they now responsible for? What are the things, how can they affect my life as a member of the voting public? Now, very related to their responsibilities, what are the skills required to perform those responsibilities? Right. So if it's a mayor and you're going to be helping to, draft legislation, then you probably should have some sort of skill surrounding legislation or the law or something that lets the public know if this person has something to say on legislation, they probably know what they're talking about, right? It hopefully is reasonable to assume that. Now, with the responsibilities and the skills required, if we bring it back to the election issues, not every election issue is going to be relevant to every role. If something is very related to the finances and there's, one role being voted on that has a particular ability to affect that, but maybe another one doesn't, right? Like if you're trying to figure out how you can afford road work and you're voting on the city clerk, well, they might not have the rights to sort of decide how money gets spent. So we might not be concerned about what their view on how to pay for road work is, but there might be a few election issues that do relate to the clerk. So we want to see where the clerk stands on those issues. And finally, if there is a role being voted on that can appoint people, like a mayor or president or that sort of thing, then what are those positions? And again, what are their responsibilities and skills? So that you can understand not just, here's what the president does and here's who's running for president, but also here's the positions that president can appoint. So keep in mind when you're voting for that person. And if the information is available, we'd probably also know who they were appointing, but we'll get to that in the next part, which is candidates. So for within each role, it will show if that role is being voted on, and then if it is, it's going to show all of the candidates running for that role. So if we're voting on mayor, that's the role. Maybe there's 4 candidates. We're going to have 4 candidates underneath that role, where each candidate is going to show their experience, and it will try, as much as possible to directly compare that to the skills required. So here's their experience, here's their work history, here's their training, here's what they've done in the past, and then here's that compared to their skills to help people understand, does this person have the skills required? Next, what's their platform? What are they saying they're going to do? And like we talked about previously, you'd want to compare that to, for example, the party platform. If this person is, if they've been elected in the past, you may also want to look at when they were elected in the past, how many of their campaign promises did they fulfill? Because even if you love somebody's campaign platform, if they only achieve 8% of their campaign promises, well, then their platform is kind of moot because I don't trust that they're going to do anything anyway. Now we also want, and this can be related to the platform, their stances on election issues. So if it is a major issue, good politicians, I would assume, will normally have that as a part of their platform, right? So if everyone cares about the environment or everyone cares about certain things to do with business or the economy, you'll generally see that reflected in the platform. But a lot of that is based on sort of either what the ballot measures are and what the media is discussing. If it's not out in the public eye where everyone's talking about it, that's an easy area for politicians to overlook. And that's where the community submitted election issues help. So if no one in the media or, on the election, if no one's talking about how to pay for road work or maybe where road work is needed, the community can still ask that question to the politicians and see who's answered what. If there's 4 politicians and 2 of them have answered that, cool. Now we can judge that answer for those 2 people and maybe try to get the other 2 to answer that question as well. Earlier I mentioned that we'd also be tracking the claims made. So, if a politician claims to be an expert in legislation and they're making claims about legislation, then people who are also experts in that realm can sort of assess that claim, and they can assess it to start with just to say, does this seem like it's referencing the relevant source material accurately? Is it being framed honestly? And we can start to get a picture of how accurate this person is in their initial claims. And as well, after time passes and we can see, did this thing happen or not happen, we can get a picture of how accurate are they. So if you have somebody that doesn't agree with the experts, but they're still correct a lot, that's good to know. And you can even have somebody who agrees with experts, but if they're wrong, they're still wrong. And that's, again, an important thing to know when you're saying, hey, this person has a history, they're knowledgeable in these areas and tend to be right. And then these areas, they don't tend to be correct. So take things that they say in that topic, maybe with a grain of salt. Now, we already mentioned that you'd want to track sort of not just which positions they can appoint, but if a candidate has made it clear who they're planning to appoint for that role, then we can also track the same sort of information for candidates for that person as well, right? So even if not everyone has announced who their head of roadwork is, if one person did, then we can look at that person's experience and platform and all of their stuff, so we can see how qualified are they, and sort of add that to the overall package of, if I elect this person as mayor, what is that going to mean to all the other things that are important to the city? And then finally, where did that person's funding sources come from, which we mentioned earlier. That's especially important in a campaign. So if we see that a person's money comes from a very particular area, that's important information for the voting public, especially if it's maybe counter to some of their platform items, right? If they say that they're going to do something for or against, the environment or business or the economy or whatever it is, and their funding sources show maybe a conflict of interest, that's important information to know as well. Now, this is a mock-up of what it might look like actually looking at an election. So we have the city of Faketown here. This is the Faketown city election. On the left, you can see the sort of 3 things up for vote. There's 2 positions within the city hall. There's the mayor and there's the city attorney. And then there's 4 seats up in the city council. And then each box sort of gives a really broad explanation to what the responsibilities of that role are and sort of, how that role might affect your life as a citizen. And then in the top right corner of each role, you can see, who's currently holding that role, if the person is running for re-election, so if there's an incumbent, and then how many candidates there are. And then to the right, you can see the election topics where the examples are road maintenance, campaign finance, and school funding. And you can see that score there. The people who are actually allowed to vote in this election are the only votes that we care about for the election topics for this election, right? So the people who vote in this election have decided that road maintenance is the number 1 issue they care about. But they also care about campaign finance and school funding. So, any relevant roles to those issues should probably chime into the election topics being asked. So next, we're going to drill into the example for mayor. So this is an example of what it might look like when you're comparing candidates. You can see here that's kind of small. Let me see if I can actually zoom in a little bit. I'm going to exit view mode here. I think I can do it that way. There you go. That's better. So present like this. No, I can't. Okay, I'll just get with it. So up at the top, we have information about the term itself. So what are you actually voting on? In this case, it's mayor. The region is Faketown, and the length is 4 years from 2018 when this mock-up was first graded to 2022. To the right of that, you've got sort of a bit more detailed explanation of what the responsibilities are. Now, in this case, it's only listing 2. There would likely end up being a lot more, but this is just an example, right? So it's saying that their role is involved in the legislation. So it's, got a legislative component that will affect what skills you probably need. And then they can appoint up to 7 roles. And we probably want to also boil that down to what those roles are and how those can affect your life. Now here, we're looking at 3 different candidates. You can see the leftmost column for the person, for Stephen Connor, says he's currently mayor, so that's the incumbent. And then you've got sort of 2 challengers. And then it's using a grid to display it so we can really see sort of a row for each thing. So that top row is experience. So we can compare the experience for Stephen, Diane, and James and say, okay, so Stephen's experience, he's mayor now, he used to be a council member, and before that school board, and before that teacher. And then Diane is currently a council member. Before that, she was a planner, and before that, she was the deputy planner. So we can start to get a picture of what their skills are, and where they might fit. And you can see here that James was or I guess currently is, a business owner, and there's likely to be some relevant skills there as well. Underneath that, we have things like the previous term, where that might not end up being in the finished thing, just because if you're not the incumbent, you don't have a previous term. Top 3 priorities is sort of one possible way to show what the platform is, but to sort of keep it smaller, because you can have a really broad platform where if you have 100 different things you're saying you're doing, well, those aren't all your top items, right? What are the top things, the things that you're really leaning on in the election, and the things that if you don't fulfill those, you really haven't met what your promises were, right? If 80% of your platform are these 3 items and you didn't achieve any of them, most people would probably consider that a failure. We have things like the campaign contributions. We probably even want it to be a bit easier to compare the individual parts, right? So per candidate, how much did they get from businesses? How much did they get from citizens? How much did they fund themselves? Again, you'd probably want information around where the money is coming from, right? Are there certain industries backing this person? That sort of thing. The tags, that's the wrong thing. The tags are meant to be an idea of what are the things that the public are saying about this person. So you can tell in that first column there, that, this is very simplistic, where it's just meant to be sort of good and bad to show the idea. But you can tell there that that first person, the community is saying that, that they're doing pretty good when it comes to charity, when it comes to helping with the arts, and it comes to having actual experience in the government already. They're really not great on finance. They got some bad stuff on file there. And their ethics, they've got some questionable stuff that isn't proven yes or no, but like the public has got some open concerns around that topic. And then for the other 2, they don't really have anything bad on file yet, but they also don't have, they've got 3 things each for good. So we can tell sort of, where the person stands, what they might prioritize over what, that sort of thing. Now for political experience, that is a bit like the experience part up top, where it's just showing what their jobs have been. But this is also meant to provide a summary of the role, right? If you're the owner of a business, the public probably isn't going to have enough information to try to summarize how well you did as a business owner. But if you're the mayor, the public hopefully does have enough information to be able to vote as a whole to say, which elements do we care about, and how well did they do on those things, right? Did they fulfill their campaign promises? How do they deal with things that were unexpected when they were elected? How did things play out that way? And the goal here is to now show the items from their history that are both, political in nature, showing some form of government experience, but also how they did in those roles, right? So for the first person here, Stephen, you can see, okay, they're currently a mayor. For their previous time in office, the public is giving them a 46% grade. So not terrific. And then for city council member, 54, the first city council, 23%. So they did really bad their first, time in city council. They did pretty good on the school board after they were there for a while, and again, not great the first time that they were on the school board. And you can tell with the middle person there, Diane, that we have scores for 3 of her sort of times in office. And like, not everything might have it. So in example there, you've got 3 different instances of being a planner, only 2 of them are scored. So maybe we don't have enough information for all of them. We can only show the things that we have information for. But it's all about trying to sort of do the best summary that we can based on what information is available. And then James there has no political experience, so it's not showing anything. We're also listing what positions are appointed and sort of how that person did it at their role. So if somebody is good at appointing, skilled people that really seem to do great at their job, that's a pretty big plus. If the person just appoints their friends and family, and the people don't do great at the role, that's also important information. And then that very bottom item for infrastructure financing, that's an example of sort of a custom, like community selected election issue. So we can tell there the question is around infrastructure financing and how would you pay for the necessary road repairs. There's no answer from sort of the first one and last one, but you can see that Diane, as a planner, sort of has that on her radar, and she has an answer that she's given. Now, when it comes to answers to election questions, ideally, we actually want an answer directly from that candidate or their campaign team. But if they don't want to play ball or they don't want to take the time to do it, the goal is to also allow the community just to crowdsource it, right? Like if this person has talked about it in interviews or they've talked about it in campaign rallies, and they haven't directly talked to Wikilection to say what would you do for infrastructure financing, Diane may not have given this answer directly to the Wikilection community, but instead maybe she said it at a campaign rally. So we can just take the snippets of that to use as proof to say, here's the 3 times that she said it in campaign rallies. So we can give an answer and back it up with proof, which is an important part of Wikilection. And that is it for the issue of politics. If you're interested in learning more about Wikilection, the best place right now is probably the Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/Wikilection. There is also a website for wikilection.com that doesn't get updated quite as often as the Facebook page. And then there is a Patreon page, although it's not all that active yet because there's only 2 people. But you can sort of keep an eye out. And if you are interested in keeping in touch and learning more about what we're up to, Facebook is probably the best place for now. So I guess we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you for your time, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.